We introduced then Norm Yelm, a member of our committee, who has been most instrumental in obtaining the services of Bishop Jonson this afternoon, and has also been gracious enough to be his host while he's in the area. Norm?
Thank you, Claire. Time was in the 1980s when I was on the staff of the Lutheran World Federation. I thought that I lived as far from Geneva as anybody. But there were two people who lived further. And on many a morning in the little town of Chavannes-de-Bougie in Switzerland, I would go up 300 yards to the main drag, which wasn't much, and wave down Jonas Jonson and his good wife, Brigitte Rubenson, because they were going into the Ecumenical Center in Geneva as well. And little did I think that then that Jonas would one day be an exalted bishop, or that now he would be visiting us and speaking to this group. Jonas has had an amazing career. In theology, he did his doctorate at Uppsala and really made a mark as someone who understood the condition of the churches in China during especially the communist era, the early communist era, still is a communist era. And he continues with this by being a regular lecturer and teacher in Hong Kong at the Lutheran Seminary there. He was the director of Stiftsgård at Rättvik in Dalarna in Sweden, which is an amazing institution. And for a number of years, Jonas guided that institution. Stiftsgård in each diocese in Sweden is comparable to what some of you may know as an evangelical academy in some ways in Germany. He did a term with the World Council of Churches, and when he and I were in Geneva with the Lutheran World Federation, he was the Secretary for Ecumenical Relations for the LWF. And when he left Geneva, he became Bishop of Strängnäs. That was important to me because Strängnäs is where somebody who many of you have studied and read spent many, many years as well, Gustav Aulén. And I did a small dissertation once on Aulén. And for 18 years, Jonas was there. When he retired, he didn't stop. The book which you were shown, which is available on the course of the ecumenical movement since 1968, the conclusion of the Second Vatican Council, and also the important Uppsala Assembly of the World Council of Churches, has been translated into English. He's done a major work on Gustav Aulén. And now he's just finished. He's given me the manuscript in Swedish, 460-some pages on Nathan Soderblom. It's an important event because in November of this year, 2014, it will be 100 years since Nathan Soderblom became Archbishop of Uppsala, a most improbable election as it was, but one which changed many things for the course of the church and the churches in the world. It's an amazing story. I've learned in 2 days now that we've been together more about Soderblom than I ever anticipated. I'm inclined to, I'll wave a couple of books in front of you later on. I'm inclined to read them now. Soderblom's diary and a record of his speeches when he was in the United States in 1923, and the book written by Soderblom's wife, Anna Soderblom, accounting, it's called My American Trip, My American Journey. An amazing work about that incredible trip, which Jonas will describe somewhat to us tonight. I never thought in Chauvin de Bogie that I would be introducing my friend Jonas Jonson, but it really is an honor and a joy to have him with us. You will learn a great deal this afternoon. Jonas.
Thank you for inviting me here. Is the sound all right? I heard a kind of an echo when I was listening now. Is this all right with you? On November 10th, in 1923, the Luther Society of Philadelphia gave a banquet in honor of Nathan Soderblom. He was, as we heard already, on a tour in the United States at the invitation of the Augustana Synod, but also the Church Peace Union, which was a much better funded organization, I must say, and I think that they footed most of the bill. In any case, he traveled all around this country, and after having inaugurated new buildings at the Augustana College in Rock Island, and celebrated the heroic defender of Lutheran faith, Gustavus Adolphus, with the students, and he did so in the Swedish manner. He proceeded to Detroit and Pittsburgh and Baltimore and Philadelphia, and he stayed in this city for 4 days. Everywhere Soderblom was preaching, he was lecturing, he was talking, and in fact, in 10 weeks in this country, he delivered 120 talks. As he put it himself, 2 months he spoke with the voice and 1 month without. He traveled from New York to Chicago to Philadelphia to San Diego, back to Chicago and up to Minneapolis and all around. And he came to the East Coast and covered the whole East Coast from Harvard to Philadelphia and Washington. And he concluded his visit in the States with a meeting with President Coolidge in the White House. He was traveling like a pop star, received by the thousands of people. And he took every opportunity to plant his vision for world peace and Christian unity. The American Lutheran churches had not been very responsive to any interdenominational initiative. And in 1908, they had resolved to stay outside the Federal Council of Churches in the US. So they were regarded by others as sort of at least distancing themselves from anything ecumenical. And also in Europe, they had formed their own organization, the Allgemeine Evangelisch-Lutherische Konferenz. It had gradually come to include some Americans and some Scandinavians, but it was very much dominated by rather conservative German churches and church leaders. And Soderblom certainly did not feel himself very welcome in this circle. In spite of his own conservative and pietistic background, his reputation as a Luther scholar, and his position as Archbishop in the biggest of all Lutheran churches, this Evangelische Lutherische Konferenz and its successor, the Lutheran World Convention, which later on became the Lutheran World Federation, they were inclined to write Soderblom off as too liberal and too Catholic at the same time. And this was Soderblom's dilemma. From the depth of his heart, he believed that Luther's experience and interpretation of justification by faith was God's gift to all of Christianity. And Lutheran churches should therefore have a a very great contribution to make to the world church at large. But the Lutherans, they stayed outside this new movement. They didn't want to get involved, and they did not fulfill Soderblom's dream of sort of balancing the Anglo-Saxon dominance of this new ecumenical movement. Many Lutheran churches of the time were, of course, loaded with dogmatic orthodoxy, with pietistic quietism, and what we today would label fundamentalism. The onslaught of modern theology, with its historical critical reading of the Bible, had reinforced the confessionalistic Lutheran attitudes. And for Soderblom, who was organizing Life and Work and the big Life and Work conference in Stockholm to be held in 1925, it was of highest priority to get the Lutheran churches on board. And therefore, he had chosen to travel to the United States at the invitation and under the auspices of the Augustana Synod, rather than the Federal Council. The Federal Council had in fact already invited him a couple of times. He had spent the post-war years on strategically building inter-church relationships. He was the Archbishop of Uppsala, and he had built a block of Lutheran churches around the Baltic Sea. And through massive and very imaginative efforts to bring relief to the German people who were suffering starvation and because of the post-war blockade that was also supported by the United States. And by participating in a number of Lutheran church assemblies in Germany, he had won the grateful confidence of many of the Lutheran churches, and he was a friend of the different Landeskirchen, who now in Germany were in a very difficult situation. The empire of Kaiser Wilhelm had fallen, and the Weimar Republic had been constructed, and the churches tended to be very monarchical in heart, while republican for pragmatic reasons. And in the midst of it all was Soderblom. He had also continued to develop very close ties with the Church of England. But suddenly, in February in 1923, it looked as if his very patient work to build this kind of relationship between all the churches of Europe was all wrecked. Because France occupied, as some of you may recall, they occupied the Ruhrgebiet in order to force the Germans to pay their war debt and also to control that border. And the Swedish bishops, not only Soderblom, but he actually, for once, he had the Swedish bishops behind when he wrote a protest which was addressed, of course, to France, but also to President Warren Harding, that the French occupation of the Ruhr must come to an end. It was a plea that they made in the hope that the United States would change its isolationist policy. And this concern Soderblom very much shared with Reinhold Niebuhr. And the reaction was extremely strong. The French president sent immediately the longest telegram I've ever read, 6 pages long, where he defends the French action. And the relations with the Fédération Protestante de France, all the Protestant churches in France involved with the ecumenical movement, they were interrupted for more than a year. And it really looked like the whole 1925 conference hung by a thread. It was only in Germany that all this was welcomed, but to the embarrassment of Soderblom, because he was awarded 3 honorary doctorates and he could easily understand that this was not for his scholarly works, but rather for his political. So he did not like that particularly. So when Soderblom went to America in 1923, he did so in the midst of this turbulence that his appeal had caused. And his mission was now not only to encourage the Federal Council and the Church Peace Union to involve themselves with the Stockholm Conference. They had already committed themselves to it. But it was much more to get the American church, Lutheran churches to do so. So he spent these 10 weeks visiting all over, speaking all over, and really trying to get the American churches with him. It wasn't all that easy, because there was much prejudice about Soderblom also in this country, and we may hear more about that. So when he came to Philadelphia, this was his agenda, and he delivered a lecture for the Lutheran Society of this city on, and this is such a typical theme of his, on the universal significance of Luther. And again, as he reports many times from his trips, he did so while the people who had enjoyed a dinner just leaned down and had an after-dinner smoke. I don't know how much they listened to him, but in any case, he was successful, because in 1925 in Uppsala, both the United Lutheran Church and the Augustana Synod were represented at high level. When Soderblom came here, he had already served as Archbishop for 9 years. He had been elected to the office by an extremely narrow margin, without a single vote from his fellow bishops-to-be. He had hardly gotten any votes from any diocesan chapter. He had got very few votes in his own diocese of Uppsala. But as the Archbishop's office also was combined with the office of Vice Chancellor at the university, professors also had a say. And in fact, he got the votes of the professors, not of the theologians, but the faculties of art and the faculties of science all gave him their votes. And that was really what made it possible for him. But still, it was with such a narrow margin. There were, the panel had to contain 3 names. And the first 2 of them were very conservative, old established bishops. And they got more than twice as many votes as did Soderblom. So he came 3rd on that panel. And he slipped into it only because in one of the diocesan chapters in Västerås, there were 3 even votes. So they had to use the lot. And at that straw vote, Soderblom got in. So it was that close. And had he not gotten that lot in Västerås, he would never have been an archbishop. And the world, and the ecumenical world particularly, would certainly have been somewhat different. So this could, and I think it's right to say, like my old teacher Bengt Sunkler, to say that this was a providential accident. At the time when this happened, he was serving as a professor of history of religion at the University of Leipzig in Germany. And in the same week that the World War I began, he returned to Uppsala. He barely made it on trains overcrowded with cheerful young soldiers on their way to battle. And among them were some of his most gifted students who would be dead within weeks. Soderblom was internationally widely known as a scholar of religion. He had earned his doctorate at the Sorbonne and had taught as professor at Uppsala since 1901. History of religion was at that time a comparatively new field of study, and with his phenomenological approach, he had gained a great academic reputation. In his lifetime, he was awarded no less than 14 honorary degrees. And he concluded his academic career by delivering the prestigious Gifford Lectures at Edinburgh just before he died in 1931. Becoming Archbishop, with that kind of background, becoming Archbishop, his life took a new turn. And he experienced this as God's direct and personal call. In the early 20th century, the idea was widely spread that individual personalities, they could be explorers or scientists or political and religious leaders, they could be artists and even successful businessmen, were chosen to lead the progress of history. Soderblom shared this personalistic understanding of history, and he often referred to great personalities as geniuses or even saints. He spoke a lot of saints, this Lutheran. I think that there is hardly a Lutheran in history who has referred to saints more often than Soderblom. And there is no doubt that he himself regarded his providential election as a confirmation that he himself was chosen for a particular ministry of reconciliation, for unity and peace. He was determined to make full use of his position as Archbishop, to fulfill his vocation at a momentous time. For this purpose, he did not hesitate to inflate the Archiepiscopal See of Uppsala in the eyes of the world, and to put it on par with Canterbury, but also with Constantinople and Rome. His consecration on November 8, 1914, just 100 years ago, was planned as a magnificent ecumenical manifestation, but the war prevented most foreigners from attending. The Augustana Synod, however, was represented at this occasion, and Soderblom made it a special point to have Dr. Lars Abrahamsson, the editor of Augustana, who was there. He had him as the only non-Swedish assistant participate in the laying on of hands. 9 years, and maybe I should add that the response was immediate. In the same afternoon arrived a telegram from here where they thanked the Mother Church, who had this way affirmed the daughter church in a way that had been unheard of. And there was great happiness expressed from here. 9 years later, Soderblom had established himself as the most charismatic, open-minded, and energetic archbishop that the Church of Sweden had had since the Reformation. But he remained controversial, theologically and politically. He was, no doubt, a genuine liberal theologian in the line of Albert Ritschl, and in addition, a person highly committed to social justice. His opponents would look at him not only as a self-indulgent heretic, but also as a kind of a socialist, using his platform for opinion-making for social change. And he was indeed sympathetic with the labor movement, but his social thought had not been shaped by Marxism at all. He was rather influenced by Christian social movements in America, France and Germany in the 1890s. And somewhat paradoxically, he received most of his moral and financial support for ecumenical ventures, not from the church. In fact, he got no money from the church, nor from the state. All the funds that he needed to build his ecumenical projects were given to him from the old landed aristocracy and the new industrialists in Sweden, who had accumulated a lot of money during the war, selling all their goods to the warring countries. This Soderblom was a rich and a very complex character, deeply spiritual. If anyone deserves being called religious, it's Soderblom. He's a deeply spiritual man. At the same time, he's an activist, and he is ascetic and extravagant. He's an actor with close friends among artists and authors. He's a first-class musician, and is a master of rhetoric. He possessed an unforgettably resonant voice, which both attracted and in the end captivated his hearers. His speaking, preaching, and lecturing was irradiated with joy and hope, and occasionally he would spontaneously start singing in the midst of a talk, as he did to a large audience in New York when he arrived here in 1923. But there was also another side to Soderblom. His brilliant gifts were held together by a strong will and a demanding discipline, at times characterized as inhuman. He was very fond of a metaphor of racehorse and rider to express his ideal. He says, "The good horse can achieve its highest capacity and its greatest speed only under the firm hand of the rider. So it is with the soul. Only under the firm hand and the strict bridle of God can the soul be encouraged to give its best." Considering Soderblom's simple background as the son of a rural pastor, he moved with remarkable confidence and disarming humility and humor among all kinds of people, be they peasants, academics, statesmen, or royalty. After 7 years in Paris as the pastor to the Swedish community there, his French was perfect. His German was flawless, and his English was good enough to rouse admiration. He gladly used Latin, daily read his New Testament in Greek, and when consecrating Baltic bishops, he addressed them in Estonian or Latvian. Nobody doubted his extraordinary intellectual capability, but he was more admired and remembered for his work capacity. To him, time seemed to have no limit. His dance program on his tour here in the US is sufficient to prove the point, even more so as he had been down with a heart attack just a year before. His ecumenical vision was shaped early through the Student Missionary Association at the University of Uppsala in the 1880s, and more particularly at a student conference at Northfield, Massachusetts in the summer of 1890. He arrived there as a born-again Christian. He had really just been through a very profound spiritual experience. And he was profoundly impressed by Dwight Moody and Ira Sankey, and made friends with people like John R. Mott and Winfred Monod, who 30 years later would become his close collaborators in the ecumenical movement. In New England, he first encountered the kind of energetic Anglo-Saxon supranational Christendom out of which so much of the ecumenical movement sprang. At a meeting with Newman Smith, who later wrote the important book Passing Protestantism and Coming Catholicism, he jotted down a prayer which guided him through all his life. "Lord, give me humility and wisdom to serve the great cause of the free unity of thy church. So when he took leadership in the ecumenical movement, he was well prepared. He had lived in France, visited Britain often, and taught in Germany. He was part of an impressive network of personal relations. And again, I may add, Soderblom was the kind of a person who literally gathered people. Had he been me now, everyone that he spoke with, he would have jotted down on paper and put in his archive, because who knows when you need that person again. So he had this network of people and already a very voluminous correspondence. He is a letter writer like nobody else. There are some people say that the archives contain 90,000 letters. I think it's a little less than that, but it's very impressive, and it's impossible for anyone to go through the whole thing. In any case, he had negotiated the agreement between the Church of Sweden and the Church of England in 1909 that led up to full communion between the two churches. In 1911, he spent a few weeks in Rome and in Athens and in Constantinople and got in touch not only with the liturgical traditions of these churches, but also got to know some key people in the Orthodox Church, which became very important for him later. And gradually his ecumenical vision and vocation matured. But then he had to experience firsthand how the First World War completely disrupted Christian culture in Europe, and overnight turned brothers into enemies. And then he felt compelled to act. He mobilized all his perseverance, diplomatic skill, and social competence to make European and American Christians meet and rebuild confidence. The worst obstacle that he faced was the enmity and mutual accusations that prevailed between the French and the German. Unless the Germans admitted their guilt for the war, the French would not see them eye to eye. With the unfair Treaty of Versailles under the auspices of President Wilson, the situation grew worse. And it was Soderblom's greatest diplomatic achievement that he succeeded in bringing the enemies together in Stockholm in 1925. And only a year later were they prepared to leave what was called La Schuldfrage behind. It is the First World War that may make us understand Soderblom's and his motivations. Already before his consecration in 1914, at his own initiative, he prepared an appeal for peace to be distributed among church leaders all over the Western world with the hope that they would sign. The words flowed out of his own troubled heart. I quote, "The war is causing untold distress. Christ's body, the church, suffers and mourns. Mankind is in its need, cries out, 'Lord, how long?'" He could not but remind, quote, "especially our Christian brethren of various nations, that war cannot sunder the bond of internal union that Christ holds in us, and call upon God that he may destroy hate and enmity, and in mercy ordain peace for us." This was one of the very first peace appeals. There had been one a couple of weeks before by the Pope, but this one was the one where people were invited to sign. And among the first signatures was Charles McFarland and Shaler Matthews of the Federal Council in the US, but also church leaders in the neutral countries like Netherlands, Switzerland, and Sweden. But to his disappointment, churchmen in the belligerent countries refused to put their names to the document. Only a few months into the war, the national war frenzy, to which preachers had made no small contribution from pulpit and rostrum, already ruled out any church cooperation for peace. Soderblom himself was filled with affection for France, Germany, and England, and he had personal friends on both sides of the trenches. And at the heart of his faith was the cross of Christ, and he was deeply convinced that reconciliation with God and the unity of the church were conditional for peace. Therefore, he pursued with almost superhuman patience and energy attempt after attempt to make Christians defy hostility and seek unity. While fulfilling his many episcopal duties in his large diocese and in the Church of Sweden as a whole, he made one attempt after the other to reach out to the churches with an invitation to meet and to cooperate for the sake of peace. But only after the war was he able to get the process started, which led up to the Universal Christian Conference on Life and Work in Stockholm in 1925. And with the risk of speaking far too much, I would remind you, as we are in this part of the world now, that Europe, during the First World War, all the churches, with few exceptions, were state churches, completely intertwined with the policies and cultures of their states. And therefore, when the states went to war, the churches went with them, and the confrontation was so strong, and it was almost impossible to find a formula on which churches as such could act, in a sense, independently of their nations in this situation. And that was the dilemma that Soderblom was facing. How on earth do you make churches completely identified with their nations work together for something different than their nations do? Soderblom's goal and strategy and tactics developed as he moved along. He pragmatically adapted himself to the rapidly changing political situation, but he never lost his focus on furthering peace by uniting the churches and strengthening international law and arbitration. His theological presumptions remained the same. The first was that God is a living God, revealing himself through prophets, historical events, and in all authentic religion, and acting through individual persons who put their lives at God's disposal. The second is the distinction between the church as a body, an organization, an outward framework, which can take a multitude of forms, and the church as spirit, which is one and the same. The unity of the universal church is a unity in spirit and a unity in diversity. Soderblom consistently rejected uniformity in doctrine and ministry as an ecumenical goal. He respected the individuality of each church as it was shaped by cultural circumstances. He was suspicious of the kind of incarnational theology he had found among Anglo-Catholics, because it could imply that just one kind of church structure was designed by God. And the third presupposition was that all churches equally share in the Catholicity of the one holy and apostolic church. There was Orthodox Catholicity, Roman Catholicity, and Evangelical Catholicity, and no church had the right to claim to be more Catholic than others and to pretend to be more normative. For Soderblom, the episcopal ministry was both a sign and an instrument of such Catholicity, and he spared no efforts to have episcopacy reintroduced where it had been lost. He saw to it that it was introduced in the Tamil Evangelical Lutheran Church in India. He ordained bishops in Estonia, Latvia, and Slovakia, and he also made an effort to convince Kaiser Wilhelm II personally to have German superintendents ordained as bishops. What mattered to Soderblom was that bishops represented an unbroken continuity with the undivided church. His ecclesiology was shaped by his sense of history. To him, the Reformation was exactly what the word says, not an interruption, but a renewal of the living tradition. As a child, he had worshipped in the unaltered 14th century church at Trönö, and he maintained a somewhat romantic understanding of medieval times. In the weeks before his appointment as Archbishop, he made a qualified study of the liturgical history on the consecration of the first Archbishop in Uppsala. His name was Stephen, in 1164. Soderblom had developed his thinking on evangelical Catholicity when encountering the Church of England, and he was of the opinion that his own church, the Church of Sweden, had preserved its integrity in relation to the state and its continuity with the past, even better than had the Anglicans. This made the Church of Sweden suitable to serve as a bridge church between traditions. But he never made apostolic succession a condition for communion, nor did he regard evangelical Catholicity as a liturgical program. Reflecting on his own ministry, he would describe it by using the image of 5 concentric circles. The first one and primary one was, of course, his own diocese. The second, the National Church of Sweden. And thirdly, all Lutherans of Swedish descent in other countries. And most of them happen to be Augustana people. And then, fourthly, he would speak of the Lutherans of other nationalities. And finally, about the universal church. So when he visited here, his visit with the Augustana Synod turned into a kind of an episcopal visitation. And towards the end of it, he had a lot of advice to give on how to further relations with the Episcopal Church and other things. He would certainly have welcomed the Augustana confirming its Swedish roots by ordaining bishops in the Swedish tradition. Soderblom did, in fact, participate in the laying on of hands when Gustav Brandell was installed as president of the synod. But Brandell never regarded this as a consecration, nor did he ever use the pectoral cross, which was later handed over to him by the Swedish bishops. But this was, as I said, the time when Scandinavian and Lutheran and German Lutherans generally held church and nation identical. And Soderblom, in spite of his love for its particular history of Sweden, he consistently emphasized, and he did so already as a very young man, the universality of the church as the prime characteristic. His mission was not to create unity between national churches, but to make the real but invisible unity of the universal church visible. And he always used that kind of formulation, that the unity already is there. Our task is to make it visible and practical. If Christians work together for the common good of humanity, their unity in faith would be revealed to the world and made real to themselves. He respected faith and order, but he simply couldn't afford the time to wrestle with dogmatic and liturgical problems the way the world was. He felt that there were more burning things that had to be done. And therefore, he Also, when he came to Lausanne, the first Faith and Order Conference in 1927, I must say that his presence there was a failure. His distinction between the soul and the body of the church found little response. And his definition of evangelical Catholicity was questioned by those who felt that it relativized apostolic succession. And the report from his section was actually outright rejected at the initiative of Bishop Gore of England. And he left the conference while they were struggling in the group to try to improve that report. But the report was never approved of. It was only received for further consideration. Soderblom was a man of action. And of course, in the eyes of many, he was exceedingly liberal in doctrinal matters. Truth was for him grounded not on dogmas, but in personal experience. He had himself encountered the living God in a decisive moment of conversion, a direct experience of God's holiness. And since then, trust and confidence were the characteristics of his seemingly unshakable faith. Am I spending far too much time on this? Oh. Soderblom lived at a time when world Christendom was thoroughly transformed by external and internal forces. Empires disintegrated, monarchies gave way to republics, German state churches became independent, and Russian Orthodoxy faced severe persecution. At the same time, Christianity expanded rapidly in other continents, and American denominationalism became the ecclesiological novelty. Faith itself was severely challenged by science and secular ideologies, and not least by the loss of credibility as Christian nations fought their devastating war. In an exceptional way, the churches of Sweden and England were able to make their transition into modernity with structures comparatively intact. Uppsala and Canterbury therefore felt a particular responsibility as agents for peace and unity. Already in 1908, the Church of Sweden had been invited to send an observer to the Lambeth Conference. In 1888, the Lambeth Quadrilateral had been approved with 4 conditions for the reunion of the churches. Since the Church of Sweden fulfilled all those conditions, including the one on the historic episcopate, there had already been certain initiatives to establish formal relations. When the invitation to the Lambeth Conference arrived, Soderblom, who at the time was a young professor, not a bishop, immediately grabbed the opportunity, and in consultation with the Swedish Archbishop, he secured the governmental approval required for official relations between the 2 state churches, and arranged for a respected bishop with good command of English to be sent to the conference. He was well received, and a few weeks later, Soderblom himself, again at his own initiative, went to England, met with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Randall Davidson, and a number of other bishops to make sure that formal interchurch dialogue would be established. And already in 1909, an Anglican delegation arrived in Uppsala for, as far as I know, Bill Rush may know better, but as far as I know, the first official ecumenical dialogue ever. As a result, the Church of England fully recognized the Episcopal Order of the Church of Sweden, and in 1920, intercommunion was established, confirmed by the Swedish bishops 2 years later. At the conversation in Uppsala, the American Episcopal Church was present, represented by Bishop Mott Williams of Marquette and the priest Gustav Hammarskjöld, who was of Swedish descent. This caused a real problem. In the States, the Swedish Anglican contacts were not welcomed, since the Augustana Synod feared that a rapprochement would strengthen American Episcopalian efforts to enlist Swedish immigrants. Soderblom had friends among Augustana's leaders and was aware of the problem. Therefore, and I make this very short, but therefore he resolutely excluded Hammarskjöld from the negotiations and turned down Mr. Mott's plea for episcopal care of Swedish immigrants. And Soderblom at this occasion very, very clearly spoke on behalf of Augustana. With determination, he defended the integrity of Augustana as the Swedish church in the United States. And when he was visiting here 14 years later, the question of Episcopal-Augustana relations was raised again. And Soderblom handled it with caution, but suggested that a couple of 17th century Swedish church buildings now in the hands of the Episcopal Church might be used by the Swedes. In a sermon at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City, he expressed the hope that the two churches would recognize each other and develop as good relations as had the Church of Sweden and the Church of England. Between the First and the Second Vatican Councils, the Roman Catholic Church was guided by reactionary ultramontanism. The popes had built a fortress against both liberal democracy and all forms of socialism. In the 1890s, Soderblom had come to know a number of Catholic modernists, as they were called, in France, who were condemned by the church, prevented from teaching, and in some cases excommunicated. The most influential among them was Albert Loisy. In 1910, Soderblom had published a most significant study on Roman Catholic modernism, which regrettably was never translated. Adding his immediate experience of ecclesiastical oppression and the limiting of intellectual freedom in the Catholic Church of the time, and his anti-institutional ecclesiology, it is not surprising that Soderblom often expressed a strong anti-Roman sentiment. This did not, however, prevent him from making every effort to invite the Roman Catholic Church to his conferences or to be touched by authentic Catholic spirituality. Participating in the Holy Week services in Rome, he had a deep sense of what today is called spiritual ecumenism. The only answer he received to his invitations, however, was an unambiguous non possumus, impossible. In 1928, the encyclical Mortalium Animos charged the ecumenical movement and Soderblom with theological relativism and forbid Catholics to have anything to do with ecumenism. Only at the end of Soderblom's life did he get the opportunity to enter into a serious dialogue with the Jesuit scholar Max Prebilla on the conditions for Christian unity. At his visit to Constantinople, as I already mentioned, in 1911, Soderblom purposely began to build relations with Orthodox churches. His personal friendship with Metropolitan Germanos of Thyatira proved decisive for the Orthodox participation in the ecumenical movement. And during the war, Soderblom maintained contact with the churches in the Balkans, in Greece, Constantinople, Egypt, and Russia through Swedish diplomats and relief workers. And he exerted a certain influence on the famous patriarchal encyclical of 1919, which prepared the way for the vulnerable Byzantine Church to involve itself with the ecumenical movement. including the Orthodox, was not looked upon with approval by most Protestant leaders, but it was essential for Canterbury. To achieve his goal, Soderblom, at a planning conference in Geneva in 1920, in his unpredictable manner, staged an appearance of several Orthodox bishops, and the Protestants were taken by complete surprise and accepted the enlargement of the venture. The Stockholm Conference in 1925 was the fulfillment of Soderblom's dreams and the incomparable event of his life. With more than 600 delegates, including a large number of Orthodox, headed by Patriarch Photius of Alexandria, it was the most representative gathering of Christians since the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea 1600 years earlier. It was Soderblom's affair altogether. One could say that the conference was an extension of his personality. The program was hopelessly overloaded. The actual result, meager, and burning problems were swept under the carpet. Still, the conference was a healing experience. After a decade of strife and destruction, it was a new beginning. There was energy and vision, prayer and personal encounters. There was pomp and circumstance, and a great hospitality in beautiful August weather. The expenses were covered by Swedish donors. Among the stewards, just a footnote, among the stewards was a young man called Dag Hammarskjöld, for whom Soderblom was the mentor and a very close family friend. Nothing like this meeting had ever happened before. It's hard for us to understand, but nothing like it had ever happened before. Participants simply couldn't find words for their emotion and inspiration. Used as we are to thousands of big conventions and international conferences, we can hardly imagine what the Stockholm Conference was like. The universal church was gathered in all its exotic diversity. The world press was there, and Soderblom's call for justice, peace, and unity was amplified all over the world. In his own analysis of the conference, he concluded that the very fact that they all had met was the most significant achievement. The ecumenical movement, however, limited in size, had begun to move. In spite of recurring health problems and an overload of responsibilities at home, the post-Stockholm years were filled with international assignments. Soderblom had now become the great European of his time. He was invited to speak and to preach at all kinds of events all around Europe. The Ecumenical Council, which he had aimed at since 1919, was formed only in 1930, and the World Council of Churches, which he had foreseen, was constituted in 1948. But as his own liberal theology and all what we call Kulturprotestantismus of Germany, as all that was overrun by events in Europe, he was soon forgotten. People like his disciple Gustav Aulén and in the continent Karl Barth set a new tone, and the ecumenical movement took a new course. And Soderblom was remembered, but he did not impact the movement as much as one could have expected. At the time when Christian values were compromised and Christian civilization was again on the brink of complete bankruptcy, like an Old Testament prophet, he had reminded the churches of their calling, and like his admired saint St. Augustine Jeanne d'Arc, Gustavus Adolphus, and first and foremost Martin Luther had revealed the will, mercy, and righteousness of God. His recognition of God's revelation in all authentic religion, his constant adherence to principles of justice, his promotion of binding international law, and his trust in a living God continue to challenge world Christendom. Nathan Soderblom died a sudden but saintly death on July 8, 1931. Time and again, in many languages, he had repeated, "A saint is one who in his or her life shows that God lives." Was he not one of them?